For more debates, updates and bonus content, sign up at thebigconversation.show.
Well, I think the roots of my change of mind really happened when I was at school. When I was studying sciences as an atheist, very, very clear, science entails atheism. And then, knowing I was going up to Oxford to study chemistry, having some time at my disposal, I thought I'd read the literature about the history and philosophy of science, which up to that point I'd ignored. And after reading it, you began to realize that the kind of scientific positivism I'd imbibed, science proves everything, it's absolutely secure knowledge, actually was rather more complicated than that. And so I began to realize, look, the history of science is saying this is what people used to think, now they think this. And you began to just get this idea that maybe this is what we think now, but what are we going to think in 50 years' time? How can we be secure because it's a moving landscape? Didn't convert me or anything, but did make me think this is rather more complicated than I'd been told. And I think in many ways that probably was the end of my love affair with atheism, because I felt it was hopelessly simplistic, or at least the forms I knew. And I think that really what drew me to Christianity was this deep sense that actually it offered me, if I put it like this, a bigger picture of things, a way of making sense of myself, of our world, and also providing conceptual space for science. In other words, I continue to love science and feeling that this was something that really mattered, but having a sort of framework into which I could fit it. So I'm not in any way hostile towards atheism, but I do feel that kind of where there are questions one wants to have in discussion, which is why I think tonight's conversation could be very interesting.
Good. You've obviously done a lot of work in recent years engaging atheism, the new atheism particularly of people like Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens and co. Do you feel like, in the decade or more since books like The God Delusion came out, we're any further along in this conversation, that people are more willing to look at things from your perspective and that sort of thing?
Well, I don't know whether people want to look at it from my perspective or not, but I think what there was this feeling that actually it's just not that simple, that there has to be something better than this. And I think we could say that the new atheism is waning and something else seems to be coming in its place. But I would be hesitant to say what that something else is, because I can see various possibilities. What I do think is that the new atheism is a very good example of the law of unintended consequences, because in effect a movement that wanted to shut down the discussion about religion has actually opened it up. And I think that is quite remarkable in many ways. I think people like the questions that are being asked, but weren't sure about the answers being given, and the questions are still there on the table, which is why we're having this conversation.
Well, Allister, thank you for joining me today. Many people will know you as the person behind the Dawkins Delusion. You've written many more books besides. In fact, I can hardly keep up with the number of books you seem to be able to write. But many may not know your own background, because you haven't always been a Christian. In fact, there was a period of your life when you were an atheist. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. I grew up in Northern Ireland back in the 1960s. And I've lost my accent, but, it was a very, very rough time. There was real religious tension between Protestant and Catholic. And also I was studying the natural sciences at school. I wanted to go on and study science at university. And I came to the conclusion, look, science says there's no God. End of discussion. And look at all this religious violence. No religion, no religious violence. It's easy. You go work it out. And so I was an atheist when I was a younger man. In fact, I'll go further than that and say I was actually really quite an aggressive atheist, someone who thought that religion was for losers. In fact, I sometimes get a bit nostalgic when I read Richard Dawkins, because I think, I used to be like that. So it's really quite sweet in a way. But then everything changed. And what happened was I went up to Oxford University to study science in detail. And I was forced to rethink everything. I began to realize that, the case for atheism wasn't as good as I'd thought. And also, Christianity, A, wasn't what I thought it was, and B, it turned out to be rather more exciting and interesting than I'd thought. And so, to cut a very long story short, in my first term at university, I said, this is for me. I want to be a Christian. I think it was an intellectual conversion. It was my mind suddenly saying, this is right. And as I've grown older, I've discovered there's a lot more to Christianity than simply being right. But actually, that was what captivated me in those days. And, it still captivates me today.
Many people might scratch their heads and wonder, how could you, as a biologist, someone interested in science, suddenly have this revelation, which then led you to believe extraordinary things like a resurrection of a dead man, something on the face of it quite unscientific.
Well, I think that's right. I'd want to say that in many ways, I think one of the discoveries I made was that in the sciences, there are many things that scientists believe but can't actually prove to be true. And that sort of gave me permission to begin to think thoughts that I had thought were illicit, like, there might be a God, there might be a deep meaning to life, that the way the world is might reflect a deeper meaning beyond it. And so there's no way that kind of way, simply moving from science to Christianity involved me suddenly saying, oh, the resurrection happened. It was much more beginning to consider this in detail, beginning to realize, this big picture makes an awful lot of sense. So it's gradually beginning to explore a different way of thinking, if you like, standing inside it, looking out from inside and saying, hey, this works. And beginning to realize this is something I could take very seriously indeed.
I think one of your theological heroes might be C.S. Lewis. You quote him quite often, and there's a particular phrase that I've seen crop up time and again in your writings, which is where he talks about, I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that is an analogy. And so is that a sense in which the way Christianity appealed to you as not just seeing it in itself, but also seeing the whole world through its lens?
Well, that's right. And obviously I've got a sort of affection for Lewis because, like me, he came from Belfast. And actually, like me, he was an atheist to begin with, then discovered faith, although he discovered faith a lot later in life than I did. But Lewis's quote, I think, is very, very good, because he's saying, look, faith makes sense in itself, but it makes sense of everything else as well. And that's the way I feel about things. And in many ways, I keep quoting that bit of Lewis to indicate the intellectual robustness and vitality of faith. There's more to faith than that. But for me, that's what really matters.
And what about atheism then? Because atheism is the worldview that you're interacting most with, it seems, at the moment. Is it, as it were, by contrast, an illogical point of view, or is it just as rational? It's just they have other reasons which they would posit as being the reason they don't believe in God.
Well, I'd want to say I would never dismiss atheists as irrational or deluded. When someone starts using that kind of language, they've just lost the plot.
I can't imagine who you're referring to.
The point I'd want to make is that for me, atheism makes rational sense if you think that we are limited to what human reason can prove to be true. Christian faith is about being liberated from the prison house of rational thought. It says there is more to life than what reason can discover. It's not irrational, it goes beyond reason. It's like leaping over a wall and discovering on the other side there is a beautiful landscape which you can't see from inside the prison house.
It's difficult though, isn't it? Because very often a Christian will want to help someone who is not a Christian to see it from their perspective. But we're all essentially locked into our own perspective. And so when you speak to an atheist, how do you, move them beyond what is their own worldview, which is that reason is the only tool we have. We can't do this leap that you're talking about, Allister, beyond the bounds of reason and think that there's some, transcendent realm. We have no physical evidence for it. I mean, what do you say to them?
Well, I think what I want to say, first of all, to people who listen to me now is, since I used to be an atheist myself, I've been there, I understand it, and I think actually I can say something helpful to people in that situation. But if I was talking to an atheist right now, here's the sort of thing I'd want to say. Maybe we need to trust our intuitions as much as our reason. This deep intuition so many people have that there must be more than what we see around us, that there's something deeper, something more significant, maybe just round the next corner, over the next hill. There's something there and we haven't found it yet. That's a very good starting point for a discussion, because one of the big issues is going to be, will reason take us there? Well, reason can tell us that 2 and 2 make 4, but that isn't going to get me excited in the mornings. But supposing reason points hesitantly and says there might be a God. Don't know what it's like, but there might be one. And then I'm able to say, actually, I can go further than that. Not against reason, but further than reason. Say, there is a God, a loving God, going beyond reason, but continuing the trajectory that reason has begun. Faith brings reason to fulfillment. The problem is atheism simply says, reason, that's it. No. Reason starts the journey. Atheism stops. Faith says, no. we can go further than that. And when we go further, we discover the most wonderful country one further stop along the line.
We do a show here on Unbelievable that engages with apologetics a lot, the defence of the Christian faith. I often think that's as much to challenge a non-Christian as much as it is to, in a sense, help Christians to make sense of the beliefs they have, in a way. I mean, part of that is, in a sense, doubt. I think every Christian experiences doubt about perhaps just literally the existence of God, or maybe about certain doctrines within Christianity. I'm guessing you've probably experienced moments of doubt in your life. How have you dealt with those, and what advice would you give to someone who's experiencing
you're
doubt?
Quite right. And certainly, particularly as a young Christian, I did experience what I call quite severe moments of doubt. How can I prove this? What's the reason for this? And sometimes we make a distinction between cognitive doubt. I'm not sure this is true. And existential doubt. What's the point of it all? And I've been down both those roads. I think what I want to say to people is this. Number one, if we get worried about doubts, very often it's because we haven't actually explored our faith properly. Apologetics is basically about realizing there are profoundly good reasons for faith. We need to know what those are, because it's good for us to know what the foundations of faith are, what its ramifications are. That's part of our discipleship of the mind, which is a normal part of the Christian life. And of course, you can see where I'm going from here. If you sort these things out for yourself, when your friends start saying to you, hey, is faith a delusion? Hey, what do you Christians say about this? You can say, I'm so glad you've asked that question. Let me tell you, it's good for you, but it's good for your witness as well.
Ultimately, is it a sort of an intellectual argument, though? Because I think lots of us feel that we're kind of cornered, as it were, by what the secularists and the, if you like, the rationalists tell us, you know, that you have to have a certain type of evidence and it has to match these criteria for me to take your belief seriously. The vast majority of Christians haven't done that, don't have that background, and perhaps it would be impossible to produce evidence of the kind that they're asking for when it comes to justifying our beliefs. What is the answer to those who are, if you like, so sceptical as to, one feels, well, could anything I tell them, or any miracle I could even show them, actually convince them that their senses aren't just deceiving them or something?
Well, I'm a very rational person, and so for me it's just very natural to engage in rational argument. But you know, it's not the only form of argument, and I'd go further and say it's not even the best. You think of Jesus meeting the disciples by the shores of Lake Galilee. Did he say, follow me for the following 6 very good rational reasons? No. He just said, follow me. There is something intrinsically compelling about the person of Christ. Every Christian can tell the story of how they met Christ, or how Christ has given a new direction to their life. Telling that story in our postmodern age is a wonderful way of witness. It's also a wonderful way of saying this is not just true, this is real. Because in our culture these days, the big question people are asking is not so much, is this true, but simply, will this work? And you know, anyone who's got a living faith can say, it certainly works for me. Let me tell you how I discovered it and how it makes sense of things. Let me encourage people to feel empowered. There are lots of ways of bearing witness to your faith. Rational arguments, one of them. Maybe that's where the new atheism is, because it's so rationalist. But most ordinary people aren't there at all. They know reason has its limits. They're looking for something that's going to change their lives. All of us can tell of how the gospel gives our lives, direction, purpose, and excitement.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you continue to tell your story as well as to make sense of the world around you through it. And thank you for being with me today, Allister.
Justin, a pleasure.